Brad, thank you so much for being on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. As you know, I was really enthusiastic about your book, which is incredible, and it's called Unlock Your Amazing Memory, the fun guide that shows grades 5 to 8 how to remember better and make school easier. And I reviewed it, and you were kind enough to follow up on that with this interview. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I really appreciate both the chance to talk about memory improvement and the kind review of my book.
Well, for people who aren't familiar with Unlock Your Amazing Memory yet, tell us a little bit about your story. Maybe what's your first memory about being interested in memory?
The first memory about being interested in memory was when I was myself in about 4th or 5th grade. I was horrible at numbers and names. Names wasn't helped in that we moved a lot. My dad was an executive in a company, and he was a fixer. He was someone that they'd say, well, that division or that office, that branch is having trouble. We need someone to go fix it. So my dad would get tapped for that. So we moved a lot. But I remember 3rd grade, I guess, was the first time it really came to me that memory is important. It was the end of the school year. Now, I'd gone to that school for the first time in the fall, and 3rd grade, it was at the end of the school year, though. The teacher asked me to hand out papers on Friday. We must have written some type of paper book report or something. She said, okay, Brad, you can hand out papers this week. And I just froze because I knew I didn't know everybody's names in the class. Now, as adults, we introduce each other to each other, or introduce ourselves to each other, and the kids don't do that. Kids don't come up and say, hi, my name is Sally. So part of it was that I never met people, but I had a horrible memory with names and with numbers. So I was up at the front of the class, and I had the papers, and I was going, oh, Sally, you got a B, way to go. And, kind of looking up with my eyes to see who, of the girls in the class was going, ooh, I got a B. Because that's how I knew it was Sally. I didn't know people's names. And that continued all my life. Numbers, I was always bad at math, in large part because I couldn't remember numbers. I could do the calculations. But if any of it involved storing a number in my head to add it or anything, I couldn't retain that number long enough to do the second step of the calculation. If I could write the first part down, or if I used my fingers, I was fine. The calculations weren't the problem. Those remembering numbers was the problem. There was no solution for me back then, and that's in part one of the reasons I wrote the book I did first instead of writing a book for adults first, is that there's a lot of kids like that can't remember something. Maybe they're good with math, but they can't remember the spelling of their vocabulary words, or they're great with spelling, but they, for whatever reason, cannot remember numbers like me. That's why I wrote the book. That's my first memory.
Well, how do you think, this is fascinating. I wonder, how do you think that kids enunciate their frustration with their memory? Because, you were aware of it, and that's quite an early memory, but to what extent do you observe that young kids are aware of that as being a memory problem, and how do they express it?
Back when I was experiencing that, there wasn't really a way to express it. I didn't go home to my parents and say, I can't remember names, let's get a book and help me, or let's look on the internet. We didn't have any of that back then. So I think it was kind of a suffer in silence. And it wasn't something that traumatized me, but I remember it very clearly to this day, being up in front of the class in the embarrassment of the end of the school year not knowing my classmates' names. That was just horrible. These days, kids, with the internet and more libraries and more books available on Amazon and other online availability of books, kids know that they can find solutions online. One of the things I do when I go into schools for presentations is I say something like, who thinks they have a bad memory, or who's studied for a test, been very confident. Then you sit down in your classroom, the teacher hands out the test, you look at the first couple questions and go, what? Am I in the right class? Am I in the right school? Because you cannot, for the life of you, remember these things. And kids as young as 7, 8, 9 years old are experiencing that, where they're confident, they've worked hard, and then they blank out. So they know, I think kids these days are more aware about things like money. They're more aware of, this isn't working for me and I can get help with this. So I think kids these days are willing to tell their parents or teachers or a visiting presenter like me, yeah, that's me. I have that problem. Fix it. I want to get better grades. And that's one of the joys I have, is going into schools and helping kids realize that memory, as you help people, young and old, memory isn't something we're stuck with. We can improve it, and it can be easy and fun to do. It doesn't have to be boring. Because I think that's where a lot of the kids, as they get a little bit older, either they catch on to remembering or they give up and they say, remembering is hard, studying is hard, I hate school, this is boring. The teacher says, oh, you can't remember it? That's okay, just read it again. And if you don't read well, or you don't enjoy what you're reading, which is pretty common, I think, across the ages, anybody going to school, there's always a few subjects you're like, why am I learning this? If the teacher says, oh, read it again, you read it the second time, you're even more bored than you were the first time. And the teacher says, you still don't have it, or read it a couple more times. At some point, you just go, no, I'm just not good at this. I'm just going to give up. And it's great that people like you and me and a lot of other people are out there saying there's a different way.
Right. And I think that's one of the things I admire so much, is that you're out there and you're bringing this message. And that leads me to a question that I think everybody who works in memory education encounters all the time. I certainly get it at least once a week, which is, why aren't they teaching these techniques in school? And you are actively actually going out and teaching it in schools. So how did you get into proactively making sure that memory techniques are taught in schools?
Well, I was a financial planner for a while and got really tired of sitting in an office and not being able to use my creative side. Sometimes I struggled as a financial planner with memory, with remembering some of my clients' names. You know, I remember my top several clients' names, but if someone just did something with me once, it was sometimes hard to remember their names. So I was already struggling with that. And of course, the number problem continued to haunt me, which is pretty important for a financial planner. But I also just hated sitting in the office. So one day I told my wife I should get out of this and I should go back to doing something fun. I'd been a professional juggler for a number of years before getting into real estate and then finance. And I told my wife I should go back to doing something fun like juggling, but I wanted to do something important. So maybe I should combine them and do a fun show about money for kids. And I said it just kind of as a joke to make her laugh, but she paused and said, that's a really good idea. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was a good idea. So I eventually found other financial planners for my clients. I gave my notice and sat down and wrote a school assembly show about personal finance. I did that successfully for a few years. And then I was thinking, what's another show? Money is so important for kids. But what's something else that's so important for kids? If I were back in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade and I could have any type of presenter come, who would I have come? And I wish I could say my first thought was, yeah, someone to explain money, which is what I was already doing, but it wasn't. It was someone to help me remember better. Math, science, and names. And I thought, well, if I had that problem, maybe other kids are having that problem. So I did some market research by calling a bunch of my friends that had kids anywhere from 7 to 17 years old and said, yeah, do your kids have this problem? And the universal response was, oh my gosh, yes. They can't remember anything from schoolwork to bringing home the parent signature that they have to have the paper signed for their field trip to pick up their clothes to, I'll tell them, hey, we're going to do this on Saturday. And an hour later, they'll come back and say, hey, what are we doing Saturday? Because they've completely forgotten. So I thought, well, I might have something here. So I just sketched out a few of the things that I wanted to do with the show. And I realized the way to present this is to make it fun. I can't just go in and lecture kids because kids don't want to be lectured. So I've got to make it fun. And to make it fun, I really have to demonstrate that I know what I'm doing. So I have to be able to do kind of some phenomenal feats of memory. And that means that I need to improve my memory because I don't like to just preach. I want to walk the talk. So I said, I need to make sure this works. It coincided with me turning 40 and my already bad memory in some areas getting worse. And I thought, okay, this is great. I've got this idea for a school show. My memory is getting horrible as I turn 40. I still can't remember numbers. I still can't remember. Let me make sure this works. I don't want to be going into schools and telling kids, yeah, do this, and then have a horrible memory. I want to have an outstanding memory. I want to go from bad to great and say, it worked for me. Here's how I did it. It can work for you. So I threw myself into memory training. Shortly after I kind of started with this stuff, I remembered reading an article about a memory competition. So I, on a lark, signed up for that, went and did relatively well for someone with no training. And that kind of started my love affair with memory competitions as well, which we can talk about if you want. But so eventually I got good enough at the memory feats where I felt like I could present it in a school and impress the kids and show them that I'm not just some guy talking. I'm some guy who knows what he's talking about and can do it. And continued to writing the show, started practicing the show in little bits and pieces, started memorizing the names of students when I would go in schools for my personal finance show. Gradually, over a couple of years, got better at it and good enough at it where I could actually do the show, and it took off from there.
Wow. So a large part of this was learning to teach.
Yes. I mean, as you've shown, we have to be able to do this. There are a lot of memory people out there, and I would say almost all of them, maybe a few aren't keeping up with it, but almost all are really passionate about not just helping others, but also making sure their minds stay sharp as they get older and finding the deficiencies where they struggle and saying, well, I'm a memory guy. I should be able to fix this. What would I do if I had a coaching client that said, I'm having trouble with this? And well, I'd tell them to do this, so I'm going to do that. And oh, look, it's fixed. It does work. And then next time we have a coaching client or someone asks us for advice, we can say, yep, that happened to me and I fixed it. And here's how you can too.
Right. Well, I think that's a great way of going about it. And I would say that's almost a scientific way of going about it, that you're, analyzing the issue, trying something out, checking the results, and then, improving from there, or just going with what works. Would that be sort of a fair assessment?
I think so. I don't usually think of myself as a scientist, but I certainly experimented on myself through this whole process, because for me, it's not enough to read the scientists say this or the scientists say that, or another memory guy once said this or said that. I really have to prove it for myself.
Right.
If someone says, well, this works, well, I'll try it. And the things I've continued to show others are the things that have worked for me. And I do keep in the back of my mind, as I think you've said with a couple things in your podcast, this may not work for you. This is how it works for me. But here are some other ways that don't work for me that might work for you. It's important, whether it's a yoga class or a dance class or whatever, to say, okay, if you're having trouble with this part, do it this way. Oh yeah, that works for me. So it's important to know what works for other people as well. But for me, it really has to work for me, or I can see how it could work for me if my situation were a little bit different before I'm willing to share it with someone else.
Everybody, what would that be, or what would be a better point of entry for adults to memory techniques?
Well, that's a good question. For me in my life with anything, there's always been both a need and desire. So I might desire to learn to speak French because I'm going to go to Paris for a week's vacation. But if I don't really need to learn how to speak French, well, I'll have my phone and I can always type something into the phone and it'll give me a translation, and they'll probably speak English anyway. Then there's no learning. If I have a need, like, I really need to learn some minutia about computer programming or something, but I don't really want to. I could probably hire someone to do it instead. And yeah, I'm going to do that. If there's a need but no real desire, I don't learn either. So for me, it's need and desire. So I think it's a typical bell curve, usually, at least in my experience at schools. There's a group that knows they need it because their grades are suffering and they want to have better grades. So they're receptive. Then there's a bunch that their grades are suffering and they don't really care. Maybe their home life isn't supportive of getting better grades, or they just don't see the benefit of it. So they're really not motivated to learn. There's another group that they already get good grades and they've somehow stumbled upon either our techniques or a way that they've done it themselves and it just works. They don't think about how to remember. They just read it a couple times and for some reason they got lucky and it sticks. So they don't really need. So I think need and desire, when they combine, if someone is out of shape physically and their doctor tells them, well, you should probably lose 10 or 15 pounds. Is that often enough? Not usually in my experience. But when the doctor says that and, their kids say that and they have a heart attack scare, then it's usually time to make a change in our lives. So I equate it a lot with the same question about physical health improvement. What's the point of entry for that? Because we see our bodies in the mirror every day, and for the last 60 years or so, 50, 60 years, since the mid 60s, early 70s, we've been told, eat better, exercise, do this, do that, floss, brush your teeth, see the doctor, all these things. And there's still people who don't take care of themselves physically. So I think it's an even harder uphill battle to say, let's take care of ourselves mentally, because we can get away with faking it and outsourcing our memories to our phones and going, oh, yeah, I remember your face, but I've forgotten your name. Oh, I have horrible memory. And everybody goes along with that. We can do that for years until all of a sudden we're much too early being faced with memory being a real problem. And at that point, it's even harder to kind of pick up the pieces and start learning these techniques. So they still work. It's just at that point, it's kind of like instead of being 20 pounds overweight, it's being 200 pounds overweight. And now it's time to start exercising. It's just a lot harder to get there.
There's so much in what you just said that I want to unpack, but the thing I really want to leap on first is that you use the phrase "our memory techniques," which to me is a beautiful way of phrasing that. But how would you describe our memory techniques more specifically?
Well, I think to me, the techniques come down to what many of us talk about. I know what you talk about. And then we all put our specific spin on them. Basically, converting the information into a picture, associating it with something you already know so you can then reclaim it easily, and reviewing it on occasion to have it, to tell your mind basically, hey, this part's important. Let's transfer this into long-term memory. And then we put our particular spin on it. My little spin is making sure people identify where they're going wrong first. Because back to the physical, if you want to look like more physically fit with your upper body, it's important to do a full body workout, but do you really want to be doing squats for hours on end if you want to have larger biceps? No, you want to do arm exercises if you want to have larger biceps. You may do squats occasionally to stay kind of whole body healthy, but if you want something specific, you need to do a specific type of training. So if you're having trouble, you think you have a bad memory, you need to identify, is my problem getting the information? Am I not focusing well enough? Am I multitasking? Am I not paying attention to what my kids say? And that's what I can't remember what they told me yesterday. Or am I getting the information? I pay really close attention, but my mind is so disorganized that it goes in there and there's really no system for holding on to that. It's just kind of just everything gets piled up in there, and it's kind of like piling everything up in a closet. Yeah, you can get it out of there, but if you need to get something quickly and you don't know if it's at the top of the pile or the bottom of the pile or the middle of the pile, you're throwing things around trying to find it, you're not going to get it. So if your problem's that, you really need to focus on finding a method to organize your mind and your storage. Or you're concentrating well, you're getting the information, you've stored it well, but when you're put on the spot, you blank out and you can't recall the information. But as soon as the person walks away, you go, oh, his name is Anthony. That's Anthony. And it's too late. So if that's your problem, you need to work on that. So my particular take on it is identifying where things are going wrong and helping people figure that out and directing them toward that. But I think our memory techniques pretty much go back thousands of years to placing interesting, crazy, memorable pictures in a certain order or location using the memory palace technique, or linking them together, or just associating the question with the answer. Going back to students, I know you work a lot with students and vocabulary words for foreign languages. You don't necessarily need a memory palace for that, though they can work in certain circumstances. But if you can just associate the English word with the German word, if you can picture the two of them together and create an outlandish image, you'll have that bridge to long-term memory.
Right. Well, this raises an interesting question, because for me, the memory palace is essential to memorizing vocabulary. Just a quick example, I was in Tel Aviv and recently got back, and as you mentioned that, I just thought of a phrase that I learned there, which is Eifo ha sherutim, and that means where's the washroom? And when I learned that, I used the spot that I was in right there as a memory palace, and I placed that image right there, which gives me an additional chance to find that image in my mind. And that's one of the major powers of the memory palace, and why I advocate and use it so much myself, because now it's almost 10 days since that I first learned that, and I can still recall it just by having revisited it a few times. So I raise the point, or I jump on the point also because I want to go out on a limb, and in additional research that I was doing with you and not having taken any notes, if I remember correctly, you have some history with Japanese, and something was connected with Harry Lorraine there.
Yes, that's true.
And so I would love if you would tell that story a little bit and talk about any language learning experience that you have with memory techniques, and if you tried a memory palace, and how you would see building out a vocabulary memorization approach en masse, or phrases, or what's your language learning story with mnemonics?
My language learning story with mnemonics is exactly what you correctly recalled. Very well done. After my struggles as a student, really the next time I delved into memory improvement was when I was working in Japan. I was there 7 different times over the course of 5 years, 5.5 years, 7 different trips for a total of about 3 years living there. The first trip was 10 days or so, and then a month or 2 went by, and I was going back for 6 months. And I'm a big proponent of if you're going somewhere, we should make the effort to at least learn some of the language, as much as we can. And that was daunting at the time. So I said, well, I need help with this. It's Japanese. Everybody perceived Japanese as a very hard language to learn. So I went to the college bookstore and I got a book about basically how to speak Japanese book, how to learn Japanese. And I also found a book at a bookstore by Harry Lorraine about memory improvement in general. And it really piqued my interest because there was a whole chapter on memorizing foreign languages. I'm like, this is great. Don't have time to do this now, but I'm going to be there for 6 months. When I get there, I'll have lots of spare time, and I will take these 2 books and I will learn as much as I can. So a week or so into it, I got out both the books and reading just the Japanese book. Here's how here's how you say this, and here's how you say this as a pronunciation guide, and here's some simple vocabulary. It's like this is just like any language. There's really no sense, especially if it's not a Roman type language. There's really no sense to it. It's like, why does that equal that? It doesn't sound alike. It doesn't start with the right letter. There's no rhyme or reason. It's just pure memorization. Like, well, thank goodness I brought this book. So I read Harry Lorraine's book. And it said, if you want to do this, if you want to learn this, do this. So I started basically picturing a word in English and then finding the word I wanted to learn, that word in Japanese, translating it as you suggest a lot in your training. And we have that in common. I think you take it to a better level of breaking the word down into things that I can picture, syllable by syllable if necessary. It's better if I can do a bigger chunk, but if I have to picture na, that's fine. If I have to take it 2 letters at a time, whatever, I can make a picture out of that. So I started picturing and connecting them together. I think it was kind of bad. I don't even think I read the rest of the Harry Lorraine book. I just read that section. So I didn't learn about memory palace. It wasn't even in my vocabulary at the time. I just said, I'm going to picture this word in English. I'm going to picture these syllables in Japanese. I'm going to create a funny picture together and go. And they have these cute little things in Japan. I don't know if you've seen them or if you've seen them in your travels. They're like a little key ring and a tiny little flashcard, not even the size of like half of my finger. And you write down on one side the one word, on the other side the other word, and it's a little key ring, and you can get like 50 or 100 of these at a time. So I just got a bunch of them, and I started filling one of these up a day. And between writing out the Japanese word and the English word, picturing the crazy combination, and then reviewing them and testing myself at the end of the day, I was learning 50 to 100 vocabulary words a day. And language experts I've read often say that to be conversationally fluent, you need about 2,000 words. And, you learn 100 words a day. It doesn't take that long to get conversationally fluent. And people were spellbound. The Japanese people I was working for, the English speaking people I was working with, at the end of the first week when I had 400 or 500 vocabulary words, they're going, how are you learning to speak Japanese? How are you doing that? Like, well, I got this book and I got this book, and they're like, you're a genius. I'm like, no, I'm not a genius. Trust me. And I'm like, here, let me show you. See, with this word, I pictured this, and then I picture this, and they're like, oh, that's pretty easy. And I teach them 5-10 words, and they learn them. And that's where it comes back to our earlier discussion about the need and desire. They didn't really have the need because we had interpreters, nor did they really have the desire. So the technique was there, the concept was there, but they never bothered to pursue it because it wasn't important to them. But for me, I was a vegetarian. I am a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian since shortly before I went to Japan. And this was essential. I needed to know how to say fish, how to say meat, how to say, I can't eat this, I can't eat this. Does this have fish broth in it? Is this pork? I needed to know all that stuff as quickly as possible because the translators, the interpreters didn't go out for dinner with us. So I needed to be able to say, please bring me this type of thing. So there was a real need and a desire there. And that's how I picked it up. After, I don't know, the first month or so, I was answering the phone in our office room in Japanese. And the Japanese people that were calling would say, oh, is so-and-so there? And I was like, no, she left. And okay, well, you give her the message and she comes back and here's the message, blah, 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 thinking I was a Japanese person. And I'd take down the message, and when the Japanese person would come back in, I'd say, so-and-so's called, all in Japanese, and this is what they said to tell you. And the first time that happened, she picked up the phone and called it was one of our higher level bosses, and he was confused. He said, well, who did I talk to? And she said, well, you talked to Brad. And he said, she related to me later. He said, Brad, he's not the American, the foreigner. And she said, yeah. She said, no, you're wrong. I spoke to a Japanese person. No, you spoke with Brad. Really? They were just amazed that, especially back at that time in the late 90s, that an American, a foreigner, could learn to speak their language that well, that quickly. And I'm not a genius. I totally attribute it to Harry Lorraine's teaching and the Japanese textbook I got, and just needing and desiring to get it done.
Well, yeah, and I think there is genius in actually taking action and following through. And, just to share a little bit of my own story, I've never been mistaken for being a Chinese speaker, but in 2.5 months, I went to China, and I was able to say to my future father-in-law that I liked his daughter very much and asked his permission to marry her in Chinese, and he knew what I was saying. And so it's just desire, as you're saying, and action, but I think it's the genius is in actually following through, taking action, and then having techniques that get you the result that you want. So I myself would call you a genius for doing that.
for that part, not for the other parts. You could ask my wife if I'm a genius, and she'll say I'm no. But you get into a good point there. We were talking about the educational system earlier. And that's the really tricky part, because here in America, we have Common Core. And even before Common Core, the last several years, if not the last decade or two, there's been a real discussion about whether memorizing is important. When I went to school, we had to memorize certain speeches. We had to memorize poems. I go to some schools still to this day where they make memorizing an important part, where in 5th grade, usually in the early spring, March or April, they have to do in higher education, we call it a thesis, but it's not that in-depth, but basically an in-depth book report about a topic. And then they have to get up in front of their class, just their class, not the whole school, just their class of 20 to 30 other students, and talk for 5 to 10 minutes about their topic and what they've learned, and not just off the cuff, but they have to give a speech. And that terrifies people because they can't remember their speech. A, because of the pressure. B, because they don't memorize. And a lot of students, and from what I hear, the parents push back and say memorization isn't important. We have computers, we have our phones, we can Google anything we want. Facts aren't essential. This is stupid. We don't need to teach kids to do memorization. And that's kind of something I get once in a while when someone will call about my school show, and they'll say, well, yeah, I really want it because my kid struggles with remembering, but you got to help me sell this to the other parents in the parent-teacher organization or to the principal, because we don't ask kids to memorize things anymore. Memorizing facts, memorizing formulas isn't important. Knowing how to use the formula is important, but we don't say memorize this formula and use it on the test. We say, here's the formula. Do you understand the math concept behind it enough to get the correct answer? Show us your work. And I think both are valid, but for me, the essential part is that while we may not need to memorize facts the way we used to, like any fact, because it's relatively easy. My phone, I can ask it, what's the population of Denmark, or how many whatever are in whatever. I don't need to know that. So there's an argument to be made for that. But memory is about so much more than facts. And I know I'm, preaching to the choir here with you because you know this as well. But for others who may have considered that, memory is the feel of the air as summer turns to fall. Remembering to look not just in the rearview mirror as you change lanes, but to turn your head and look as well. It's the smile of a friend or a loved one. It's the directions on how to get home if your phone battery dies. We use our GPS on our phone to get to where we're going, and then what if the battery dies or the connection's gone? Can we find our way back? it's not just here's a bunch of facts, memorize this. Oh, those memory techniques might be important. We can use a memory palace or visualizing something we need to remember, not just with facts, with anything in life. I think all of life is remembering. Comedy. I do some comedy in my act, and I like to consider myself somewhat funny when I'm not talking, very seriously. But the basis of comedy is being able to associate things and come up with a twist. You take thing A and you take thing B because in your mind you've connected them and it's a funny connection, and you share that and you get a laugh because people haven't connected A and B. So you have to be able to have both A and B somewhere in your memory to then bring your sense of humor to bear and make that connection and share it. If you can't keep things in your mind, you can't make those connections. And I think that's the essential part of any memory training. Yeah, we can learn foreign languages, we can learn all these things, but just being able to keep things in mind, whatever they are, whether they're facts that you could easily look up on Google or whether they're things that you need to keep in mind just because they're valuable to you, the exercising of the mind is the important part.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's so much in what you just said, and I want to pre-book you for the next interview because there's just so much to cover if you're willing.
Definitely,
but
always. This is my passion. I love talking about it. Well, and people my age, I think we're of a certain age. Once you're over 40, and I get people coming up to me going, "Oh, I could never do what you do. That's amazing. My memory is horrible." And as you and I have proven individually and with the people, the many, many thousands of people we've helped, as well as other memory coaches have helped, it's totally possible. This can be done. We don't have to accept a natural decline as we get older, but it does take, I'm not even sure it takes all that much effort. I think it mostly takes just a decision to try.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think the most exciting thing for me in helping people is that they're memorizing stuff anyway, no matter what. It's just, how are you going to do it? How are you going to pay attention to how you're already doing it and then make some slight modifications and shifts based on an education about how you're remembering things already anyway, Definitely.
But I do see, this is getting maybe a little bit off track, but I know you like to think about these things as well. I do see a lot of people leaning away from wanting to learn anything in general. How many people I know, I've stumbled upon a group, and I've gotten really connected with a group of late 20-somethings, early 30-somethings. And how many of them, they're 5 to 10 years out of college, brag about, "Oh, thank goodness I'm out of school. I never have to read another book."
Right.
Which to me is alarming because, okay, say you don't want to read a nonfiction book. Really, you don't want to read a fiction book, but especially the number of people I talk to who are passionate about reading who say, "Oh, no, I only read science fiction, or I only read romance, or I only read thrillers, or I can't wait for the next Tom Clancy or the John Grisham book." But no, I don't read nonfiction. Why would I want to do that? I'm not in school anymore. And to me, just the idea of kind of, underlying the memory, taking it back a step further, is the willingness to experience more of the world. And one aspect of that is books. Another is travel. Yeah, I know you're a big traveler. But how many people, I live in upstate New York. I live about 3.5 to 4 hours outside of New York City. And it's a semi-rural area. There's probably 1 million people surrounding Albany, which is the state capital of New York. But out here, I'm about an hour outside of Albany itself. And I can't tell you the number of people who, when I tell them, "Oh, I'm going here for a memory competition," or "I'm going to go down to New York City for this or that." "Oh, really? That's I've never been. Oh, where? You've never been to China? Oh no, New York City. Oh, you're 3.5 hours away, and you've never been to New York City. Oh no. Well, where have you been? Well, nowhere really.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for some people that's fine. But I think that disturbs me in many ways, because I don't think that person is going to be open and receptive to expanding their mind with memory techniques of any sort, whether it's the simplest, here's how you pay more attention so your natural memory takes over, to maybe the next step up of, here, create a few simple memory palaces and be able to, you're driving down the road and you hear a new song and you want to remember the artist, picture the name of the artist in the passenger seat of your car, and when you get home you can look her up because you'll remember her name. I don't think people who are closed off about things like travel or reading, I think that is going to extend to being closed off with learning simple, very simple techniques that can help them remember better.
I'm actually really, really glad that you went in that direction, because as unanticipated as it was, it connects with some things that are in the air that I'd love to just quickly tell you about.
Yes, please.
The first is that I interviewed Tony Buzan last week, and he was talking about similar things of this nature. So people listening to this, they will have had the chance to hear that about a week or 2 weeks before that they hear this interview they're hearing now. But okay. I think you personally are going to be fascinated with what he has to say. It's near the end of the interview. We get into some kind of dark territory. I was quite surprised. But with a big hopeful bang at the end. No hopeful whimpering, but just amazing Tony Buzan-sized bang. And the other thing is, when I was in Tel Aviv, which is where I interviewed him from, although he was in the UK, I was sitting with some friends, and we were talking about, the coming explosion of singularity and all of this jazz. And they were saying, machines are going to create our art for us, and the machines are going to do this and that for us, and yada, yada, yada. And I said, yeah, and are they going to gamble for us too? And, I was kind of being sarcastic in that moment, but for me, the reason that I work so hard at teaching these memory techniques is because I think that we are moving into a place where the human mind is going to become so soft that those of us who have trained our brains and our minds are going to be the ones who have at least that last hold on owning the machines that may or may not create the art for us, right? Because we're going to be the ones who not only can still create our own art, but we're going to, we're going to own something, and we're going to be influential on the things that are influential on us rather than just being the consumer. And so I would just wonder, in a loose, jazzy kind of way, what you think about all that, connecting with what you've been saying.
I agree. I don't know if you've seen the movie WALL-E.
Yes.
In the movie WALL-E, it's a great movie. There's humanity has escaped Earth, which has suffered and is uninhabitable, and they're in a starship, and everything is done for them by machines. So they have nice, comfy chairs they recline in, and a machine brings them, or a robot brings them, their soda drink and their food and their entertainment, and they're glued to their screens, which is not that far from current reality. And I think about, obviously they're pictured being physically soft. What's not as well pictured in that movie is the mental softness. And I fear us going there. I fear us getting to the place where we don't really need to put that much effort into thinking, or we have, in America we have some, which probably we don't need to get into, but we have a lot of people talk about having a warrior class, because there are many wonderful people dedicated to defending our country, and some of them have expressed to me that they feel underappreciated because the rest of society moves on, and the small group of people who are dedicated to serving their country have become their own caste, and it's often passed down from generation to generation, where father is in the military, and then the daughter goes into the military, and then her daughter goes into the military. And that's kind of a distinct area now where those people are very dedicated to that. And I'm grateful for them. And it just got me thinking along the lines of, are we getting to an intellectual caste where there's a small but very dedicated group of people who are really focused on thinking, basically, and learning, and absolving the rest of us from having to do too much of that. Kind of like there's, I think, less so, but even a athletic caste where there's a lot of people who are really truly dedicated to physical fitness, like the Olympics. And how many of us watch the Olympics, which are wonderful, and use it for inspiration to get out in the next couple of days and go do something physical ourselves? And how many of us watch the Olympics and sit for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours at night and never use that as a motivational tool to do something ourselves? So I think these are philosophical questions more so than memory questions, but they're interesting to think about. And I like thinking about this. I like reading for a variety of different approaches and topics and viewpoints. And I don't think there's one right answer, but it's certainly something to keep in mind and decide individually, who do I want to be? I in particular, I don't need to be the smartest person. I could probably do more nonfiction reading, but I try to read at least one nonfiction book a month and think. I like to listen to books on tape, especially nonfiction books on tape when I'm driving to and from my presentations. And, that's not for everybody, and more power to them. But I think it really shows what we put our focus on grows. If we're very focused on physical fitness, our physical fitness gets better. If we're focused on creating art, our artwork tends to get better. If we're focused on creating more connection amongst other people, deeper relationships, bringing people together, that grows. So I think maybe being a little bit of all things is better than being just a memory person or just a physical person.
All amazing thoughts, and you remind me of my idea that I really need to get back and read the Republic again. I don't know if you've read it, Plato's Republic, but
I have not.
It touches on these ideas of castes, like the bronze people and the silver people and the gold people, and there's a lot in there about who's going to rule and why, and the philosopher king idea, and it has to do with the difference between, if I recall it correctly, it's been since 2001, or even earlier, 1999, I think, since I read it. And it has a lot to do with the difference between being able to juggle information in your mind because you've memorized poetry and you understand poetry and you've learned poetry, as opposed to, or a philosophical text, because they want to get rid of the poets in the Republic. It's kind of a mixed bag, that book, because it's not even clear what they're saying about whether poets should be allowed to write or not. But nonetheless, there is something in there that if you have internalized poetry, and the lessons in poetry or literature and so forth, then you are much more suited to being one of the ruling class people or the gold people. Anyway, again, I'm like really exposing my memory loss on that book, but it's in that direction, and I want to reread it. And maybe that's something fun we could do is book a time to both read it and then have a discussion about it through the lens of memory. Because it's well worth your time to read the Republic.
Definitely, I really like how you said that. With what brought to mind is the connections. With me, the memory techniques are not necessarily an end to themselves; they're a mean to an end. The end is having a very active mind. Both now and in the future as I get older, and staying physically fit, which I work on in a variety of ways, but also mentally fit. And the same way we have kids hopefully getting recess or gym or physical fitness class as they get in the later grades, that it gets less time devoted to it. Hopefully, here in America, we have a lot of TV ads that encourage kids to get out and exercise or play physically for an hour a day, at least. And so we're encouraging that because we all know the benefits that come with having a physically healthy body. And I think reading and just thinking about these things and going, Plato didn't know what he was talking about. That's complete bunk. I hated the book. But in reading it, whether we love a book or hate it, just putting something else in our brain to think about creates more connections. And we go, okay, that kind of reminded me of what my friend in high school said. And then, that reminds me of what my boss mentioned the other day. And I don't know how this relates, but that kind of somehow makes me think of this. And we get all these connections, and we have a physically active mind that's thinking, and it's not doing the Wall-E movie where we're just kicking back in our chair, not thinking. Because I notice as I get older that it's harder to want to focus on things. It's harder to want to exercise my mind. And I mean, it's my job. I really need to do this. And even for me, the last year or so, as I get closer to 50, I see that I'm less inclined to really want to buckle down and focus. And talking with my in-laws who are both in their late 80s, they've told me about, as they've aged, what their minds have been like. So it's been wonderful to kind of ask them, well, how do you feel? How do you think now? What are you thinking? What are you remembering? And, they're very much interested in big picture, and they do have their passions, gardening and some politics, and they'll learn some detail. But overall, they're kind of big picture people, and they don't drill down and buckle down and truly focus. And I think it's really interesting how that happens, and I'm cognizant of what's going on in my own mind and willing to look at that and see what's going on.
Well, that's one thing that I have certainly loved about what you do, and in interviews that I've heard with you elsewhere, talking about your inner process, your inner experience, and that forms part of how you get it out, or why that you get out into competitions. And I do want to get into that, but I think we should save that for another interview. But to sort of bridge, what I would love to ask to kind of round off a lot of the things that we've been talking about, particularly the issue you raised about the pedagogical concern between, is memorizing learning, right? Is part of competition is memorizing a deck of cards. And I have competed once myself, and I surprised myself by both how well and poorly I did. But there was something that happened when I did it that made me understand what it is to memorize a deck of cards. So I would like to know, given what you've mentioned about this pedagogical concern of, is memorizing information understanding, and is it learning? I would like to wrap this particular interview up as a bridge to talking about competition at the beginning of our next chat. What have you understood by memorizing cards?
I take cards and the other disciplines that I've worked on as basically, to go back to the physical analogy, they're weights. They're barbells, they're dumbbells, they're Nautilus and other brand machines. The memorizing deck of cards is similar to bench pressing. It's a way for me to increase my ability to remember other things that are actually important to me. Again, whether it's something my wife said, that, there's a new song out she loves. Okay, I want to listen to that. I'm going to go online. I'm going to find the video. I'm going to listen to that and see see the video or hear it, because if it's important to her, it's important to me. So I'm not the best competitor in the world, because I don't see it as the end. It's, again, another means to the end of being able to exercise my mind. So is memorizing learning? I think it can be, but I think just because I know the steps to do something because I've memorized them doesn't mean I understand it well or could even do it. So I think it's memorizing is learning, and memorizing is not learning. I think memorizing can help us, and certainly knowing more allows us to do more of the connections in our minds, like I mentioned before. You can't have a conversation with a child, or you can't on Friday talk to a child about the realities of World War II if on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they don't remember who you told them fought in World War II. So there has to be the foundation before the higher level discussions. And I think having a base of knowledge, of reading books and meeting people and remembering how the sun changes over the course of the year because you're outside a lot. And, oh, yeah, it's grayer and darker in the winter. And I remember that. Having that base then allows us to form higher level thoughts and have higher level discussions. Without that base, it's not as much fun. I mean, talk to a child or a young person who hasn't traveled or hasn't learned, and it's not as much fun as having a conversation with someone who's traveled the world at whatever age and learned a lot of stuff, because it creates a depth of mind, that a depth of thought that it's, for me personally, a lot more fun to talk about and talk to.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, to bring this full circle, you do have a foundation for people who are dealing with younger students, and that's Unlock Your Amazing Memory, the fun guide that shows grades 5 to 8 how to remember better and make school easier. So I want to encourage everybody to pick that up. And I have a full review of it if you have any doubts about rushing to Amazon or your favorite book dealer to grab that.
It's much less deep than what we've gotten into today. It's a very lighthearted, fun, simple book without a lot of jargon or technical things. It just very clearly and simply states how memory works and how we can improve it, especially for the young people. I get a lot of people that I present to who are adults who claim they bought it for their child or their grandkid, but I read it first and I loved it. I had to get another copy for them because I'm keeping mine. So we've gotten to a lot of really deep stuff today, and just to assure any listeners, there's very little philosophy or anything like that. It's just a really fun, helpful book.
No, absolutely. As Tim Ferriss often says on his podcast when he gets into these conversations, he says, we got deep into the weeds. And I think that's perfectly wonderful. But what's coming up next for you? I understand that there are some books for a more adult audience. Is there going to be jargon in that, or is it also going to be clear and easy to understand for us adults?
I pride myself on being jargon free. I'm not a scientist. There are neuroscientists who've written some many wonderful books about how the brain actually does the things. What I'm good at is saying, this is how my brain did it, and how when I helped other people, what happened with them and what seems to work best. Give it a shot. If that doesn't work, try this. And if that doesn't work, try this, because one of these things is really going to help you improve your memory. So there are 2 books coming out. I won't get too into them, but one is going to be for a specific type of career, and another one is going to be a more general type of book, and that will not be too jargon filled. In fact, it'll be a fun book similar to my kids' book, but fun for adults. I have a memory competition coming up in November. I'm going to be doing some teaching at a university in September as a guest lecturer, and also, so I guess that end of September, early October. And in September, depending on when people are listening to this, I'm going to be attempting a world record, which I don't want to say any more about now, but hopefully by the time your listeners hear this or September comes along, I'll have set a new world record in
Awesome.
memory.
Well, I want to catch up on that then in November or December and hear everything about it. And just on a personal note to you, I really, really admire your writing style. I love to unlock your amazing memory. It helped me in several ways just because every book that I read on memory techniques, particularly the well done ones, I always pick up something new. But in your case in particular, because you write so well, so clearly, and with such great direction, it inspired me to pick up my own game. And I'm always working to be a better writer because in reality, I'm not a particularly good one, especially when it comes to explaining difficult things. So it has inspired me to pick up my game as a writer. So I really appreciate it on that account as well, because there's obviously a lot of care and craft in how that you present these ideas. And I know as a writer that it's not easy to be jargon free. So
Well, thank you.
The clarity that you bring is incredible. And again, Unlock Your Amazing Memory is great. And I can't wait to hear more about the record that you're going to break and the new books and catch up on everything that we've talked about. And I have a list of questions that we haven't even looked at because we just hit the ground running, and I know people are going to love this. I think agree that we encourage you to read, so that'll be there for you to check out. And I really want to thank you for being on the show. Any last words of wisdom from your perspective for people who are suffering with forgetfulness and want to get that out of their life?
Whether it's my book or your course, Anthony, or anybody else's, I just encourage people to look around and take advantage of Anthony's free videos and check out my book or anything, even just a Google search on the internet, because as both you and I, Anthony, have discovered and shown and taught, memory can be improved, and it can be easy and even fun to do so.
I want to thank Brad Zupp so much for being on this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. It was an absolute pleasure. I learned so much, got so inspired, and I know that he's going to inspire you. And I hope that you check out Unlock Your Amazing Memory, the fun guide that shows grades 5 to 8 how to remember better and make school easier. Again, if you want to check that out, it's magneticmemorymethod.com/middle-school. It has a link to the book, and it has me going on with all my energy and passion about exactly why that you should read it. It's just an amazing investment of your time and your energy and a few coins that are probably just rattling around in your bank, or we're about to go to coffee or something like that. So, trade knowledge for poison, or don't, but I hope that you do, because you're really, really going to be rewarded by reading his book. And I mean everything when I say that I admire his writing style, because it is absolutely incredible. It's so easy to follow along and understand and implement everything that he says. So check that out. And, we're going to be speaking again. So if you're listening to this, get in touch with either of us to give us your questions, because we would love to make sure that we address them in our next discussion. And I'm going to go into more about his competition experience and the lessons learned. I feel sometimes I ask questions in a very weird way where I know what I'm trying to ask, but I don't get them out. But my whole thing about what have you understood from memorizing cards is really to suggest that, one apparently doesn't learn anything from a deck of cards, but you do understand something from it, even though you can't say, well, I learned from this deck of cards that I've memorized that the king of clubs was beside the ace of spades, like that's what I was trying to get at in that question. But you learn from the practice of doing that. So I'm very excited to continue that conversation with Brad, and I thank him again for being on the show. And so until that we have that next episode, I hope that you are ready and prepared for the next episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, and you have read Brad's book by the time that occurs, because it'll be just 1 week from now. Thank you very much for listening and supporting this podcast with your likes and your shares and your reviews of the podcast. It really helps with getting the word out there to more people about memory techniques, and I appreciate each and every email that I get from you to Anthony@magneticmemorymethod.com. Thank you very much, and until we speak again, keep magnetic.